The hallway always smelled like lavender and lies. Sarah Martinez stood frozen outside apartment 3B, her grocery bags cutting into her palms as she processed what her neighbor had just said. The woman before her, blonde, polished, unnervingly calm, wore a smile that didn't reach her eyes and a gold band that caught the fluorescent light like a warning. "Yesterday," she had said, as if marriage was something you picked up at a corner store, quick and convenient. But Sarah knew the truth that pulsed through this building like a dark heartbeat. Marcus Webb's fiancé, the real one, had vanished 6 months ago without a single goodbye. The police had come and gone, their questions dissolving into the same dead ends that haunted every missing person case in this city. Detective Chen had interviewed everyone on the 3rd floor, his tired eyes suggesting he'd seen this story before. Someone disappears, someone moves on, and the world keeps spinning. Emma Rodriguez had been her name, a graphic designer with a laugh that traveled through walls and a habit of watering the shared plants in the building's courtyard every Sunday morning. Then one Tuesday in March, her apartment stood silent. Her succulents began to wither, and Marcus had answered the door with red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands that seemed to reach for explanations that never came. Now this stranger stood in Emma's place, her manicured nails resting on the doorframe with territorial confidence. "I'm Claire," she offered, though Sarah hadn't asked, her voice smooth as silk hiding razors. The wedding band gleamed again, and Sarah noticed how new it looked, how the skin beneath it was still pale and unaccustomed to the weight. 6 months wasn't long enough to grieve, wasn't long enough to forget, wasn't long enough to replace someone unless that someone had never really mattered at all, or unless their absence had been carefully orchestrated rather than tragically unexpected. Sarah forced a smile that felt like breaking glass. "Congratulations," she whispered, the word tasting like betrayal on her tongue, like she was somehow complicit in whatever darkness had swallowed Emma whole. Claire's eyes flickered with something, amusement perhaps, or challenge, before she stepped back into the apartment that had once echoed with Emma's vintage record collection and now stood silent except for the hum of central air. The door clicked shut with a finality that made Sarah's stomach turn, and she realized with creeping dread that she was the only one asking questions in a building full of people who had learned to look away. As Sarah fumbled with her keys, her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from an unknown number. Just 3 words that made her blood run cold. "Stop asking questions." Her hands shook as she dropped her groceries, oranges rolling across the floor like small desperate suns trying to escape the shadows gathering in this place she'd once called home. Through the wall she heard laughter. Marcus's deep rumble and Claire's crystalline giggle, the sound of 2 people celebrating something while somewhere, maybe buried in silence. Emma's story waited to be told by someone brave enough or foolish enough to listen. 3 days passed like held breath, and Sarah couldn't stop watching apartment 3B. She'd become the kind of neighbor she used to judge, the one who lingered too long collecting mail, who took out trash at strategic hours, who memorized the rhythm of other people's lives like a detective or a stalker. Claire left every morning at 7:45, her heels clicking against tile with mechanical precision, her designer bag swinging with the confidence of someone who knew all the cameras had convenient blind spots. Marcus followed at 8:15, his engineering job at the tech firm downtown, providing the perfect alibi for a man who claimed ignorance about his fiancée's disappearance. His face now smooth and untroubled, as if grief had an expiration date that came stamped with a wedding license. But it was the nights that truly terrified Sarah. Through the thin walls of her own apartment, she heard them. Not the sounds of newlyweds lost in passion, but something stranger, more clinical. Long silences punctuated by muffled conversations. Words she couldn't quite make out, but that carried the weight of negotiation rather than intimacy. Once, at 2 a.m, she'd heard drilling, the sharp whine of power tools cutting through plaster or wood or something she didn't want to imagine. When she'd pressed her ear against the shared wall, her heart hammering against her ribs, the noise stopped instantly, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like being swallowed. Detective Chen had stopped returning her calls. "Ms. Martinez," his last voicemail had said with barely concealed exhaustion, "Marcus Webb has cooperated fully with our investigation, and we have no evidence of foul play." Emma Rodriguez was an adult who had every right to leave, and sometimes people just walk away from their lives. But Sarah had seen Emma's apartment after the police cleared it, had watched Marcus box up her belongings with hands that moved too quickly, too efficiently, like someone erasing evidence rather than mourning loss. The succulents had gone to the dumpster, still in their colorful pots, and Sarah had rescued one, a small jade plant that now sat on her windowsill like a living memorial to a woman everyone seemed determined to forget. The building's superintendent, old Mr. Kowalski, had different theories over cheap beer at the corner bar. "Something changed in March," he muttered, his eyes darting toward the door as if Marcus might walk in at any moment. "I saw contractors going in and out of 3B for 2 weeks, walls being opened up, new flooring laid down in the bedroom. Marcus said it was a surprise renovation for Emma, but she never came home to see it, did she?" He'd laughed then, a sound like cracking ice, and ordered another drink to wash down whatever words he was too afraid to speak. Sarah had pressed him for more, but he'd clammed up, suddenly interested in the baseball game flickering on the television. His silence another brick in the wall of complicity that protected monsters as long as they paid their rent on time. Then Sarah found the journal. It was Thursday afternoon when she discovered it, wedged behind the washing machine in the building's laundry room, its pages water-stained and desperate. Emma's handwriting filled the pages, frantic entries about Marcus's jealousy, his rage when she mentioned leaving, his strange obsession with a woman he'd met online who looked nothing like Emma, but everything like the blonde now wearing his ring. "He said if I ever left, I'd regret it," the last entry read, dated March 12th, 2 days before Emma disappeared. "He said no one leaves him. He said Claire understands loyalty in ways I never could." Sarah's hands trembled as she photographed every page, her phone camera capturing evidence that the police had somehow missed, and she wondered how many other women's stories were hidden in laundry rooms and dumpsters, waiting for someone to care enough to look. Sarah knew she was being followed. The sensation started as a prickle at the base of her skull, that primitive warning system that kept prey animals alive when predators circled close. A black sedan appeared too often in her rearview mirror, its windows tinted dark as secrets, its presence a shadow that stretched across her morning commute and her evening walks. When she turned to look, it would glide away, disappearing around corners with the practiced ease of something that had done this before, to others, in the quiet moments before they stopped asking questions forever. She started varying her routes, leaving lights on in her apartment to suggest she was home when she wasn't, and sleeping with her phone clutched in her hand like a talisman against the dark. Claire knocked on her door on Saturday morning, her smile sharp as surgical steel. "I noticed you at the laundry room yesterday," she said, her tone friendly, but her eyes calculating, measuring, determining how much Sarah had seen and how dangerous that made her. "Marcus and I were thinking of having a little housewarming party. Nothing fancy, just the neighbors. It's important to build community, don't you think? To know who we can trust?" The invitation felt like a threat wrapped in politeness, and Sarah accepted it because refusing would confirm that she was afraid, that she knew something, that she'd crossed from curious to complicit in whatever game was being played in apartment 3B. The police finally showed interest when Sarah forwarded Emma's journal entries. Detective Chen called within an hour, his voice carrying new urgency, the sound of a man who'd seen too many cases go cold because witnesses learned to stay silent. "Ms. Martinez, I need you to be very careful," he warned, and she heard papers rustling in the background, heard him typing, assembling pieces of a puzzle that had suddenly revealed its darker picture. "We're reopening the investigation, but these things take time. Warrants, evidence collection, building a case that will hold up in court. In the meantime, don't let them know what you found." But it was too late for that, wasn't it? Claire's smile had said everything, had confirmed that secrets had been discovered, and that discovery came with consequences. Sarah started sleeping at her sister's place in Brooklyn, commuting an extra hour each way to her job at the publishing house, telling herself it was temporary, that Detective Chen would solve this, that justice moved slowly but inevitably toward truth. But doubt gnawed at her like a living thing, fed by news stories of cases gone cold, of evidence mysteriously disappearing from evidence rooms, of witnesses who recanted testimony when the pressure became too much. Emma's jade plant thrived on her sister's sunny windowsill, its leaves reaching toward light with stubborn persistence, and Sarah wondered if she was the only one who remembered that plants were living things that needed care, that people were too. that Emma had existed and deserved to be mourned by more than just a neighbor who couldn't sleep through the sound of power tools at midnight. Then Marcus appeared at her office on Wednesday afternoon. He stood in the lobby with flowers and that same easy charm that had made Emma fall in love with him once upon a time, before love curdled into possession, and possession hardened into something that swallowed women whole. "Sarah?" he called out, his voice carrying across the marble floor with casual intimacy, as if they were friends, as if she hadn't spent weeks unraveling the lie of his grief. "I wanted to apologize if Claire came on too strong about the party. She's excited about making friends in the building, and I know things have been weird since Emma left." The word "left" hung in the air like a stone thrown at glass, its violence hidden beneath the mundane, and Sarah realized with crystalline clarity that he was warning her, that this public performance was meant to establish his innocence, to show witnesses that he was reasonable, friendly, certainly not the kind of man who could make a woman disappear. The housewarming party was scheduled for Friday night, and Sarah prepared like a soldier going to war. She wore a wire, not an official one from the police, who were still building their case with frustrating slowness, but a simple recording app on her phone tucked into her bra, its microphone sensitive enough to catch whispered confessions if Marcus or Claire slipped. Detective Chen had neither approved nor forbidden it, his silence a tacit acknowledgement that sometimes civilians had to step into dangerous spaces that the law couldn't reach without probable cause. She'd practiced casual conversation in her mirror, rehearsing how to seem friendly but not curious, engaged but not investigative, normal in a situation that was anything but. The apartment had been transformed since Emma's time. Where vintage posters and eclectic art had once covered the walls, now everything was minimalist, sterile, expensive. The kind of design that looked like a magazine spread, but felt like a showroom, beautiful and utterly lifeless. Claire moved through the space with practiced grace, playing hostess with wine that cost more than Sarah's monthly groceries and cheese arranged on slate boards like an altar to good taste. Marcus stood by the kitchen island, master of his domain, telling stories about their whirlwind romance to neighbors who nodded, and smiled and asked no questions about the woman whose absence made this gathering possible. Mrs. Chen, from 3C, no relation to the detective, pulled Sarah aside near the bathroom, her elderly hands shaking slightly as they gripped a glass of Chardonnay. "I heard Emma the night she left," she whispered, her accent thick with decades of memories from another country, another life where perhaps people didn't vanish so conveniently. She was crying, begging someone to let her go. I heard a struggle, heard something heavy being dragged across the floor. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, everything was quiet, and Marcus said Emma had packed a bag and left him a note, her eyes filled with tears that spoke of guilt and cowardice. The knowledge that she could have insisted, could have demanded the police look harder, but hadn't because it was easier to believe the lie than to acknowledge the monster living next door. Sarah's phone grew hot against her skin as it recorded everything. The forced laughter, the careful deflections, the way Marcus's hand tightened on Claire's shoulder whenever anyone mentioned Emma's name, as if he could squeeze the past into submission through sheer physical will, and Claire, always smiling that razor smile, deflecting questions with practiced ease. "Oh, Marcus told me all about Emma. It's so sad when relationships end, but sometimes people need fresh starts in new cities. I hope she's found happiness somewhere." The words were perfect, rehearsed, the kind of script you'd write if you knew you were being watched, if you understood that appearances mattered more than truth in a world where people disappeared and life went on without them. Then Sarah saw it, a flash of something familiar in the hallway leading to the bedroom. Emma's distinctive leather jacket hung in the coat closet, its vintage patches and pins unmistakable, the one piece of her wardrobe that she'd treasured more than anything else because it had belonged to her mother. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized that Emma hadn't left, hadn't walked away from her life to start fresh in some distant city. Emma was here, had always been here, and the renovation Mr. Kowalski mentioned wasn't about surprise gifts. It was about hiding evidence, sealing secrets behind fresh drywall and new flooring, erasing a woman's existence one contractor invoice at a time, while her neighbors pretended not to notice the smell of fresh concrete and the sound of midnight drilling that went on far too long. The party ended at 11. neighbors filing out with promises to do it again soon, their relief at escaping palpable in the quick way they moved toward elevators and stairs. Sarah lingered, claiming she wanted to help clean up, her heart hammering so hard she was certain everyone could hear it broadcasting her terror through the walls. Claire's smile never wavered, but her eyes narrowed slightly, calculating whether Sarah's helpfulness was genuine or something more dangerous. Whether this neighbor was a threat that needed to be managed like Emma had been managed, permanently and without witnesses. Marcus disappeared into the bedroom with empty wine bottles, and for a moment Sarah was alone with Claire in the kitchen, two women standing on opposite sides of a secret that only one of them was willing to acknowledge. "You found her journal?" Claire said quietly, not a question but a statement, her voice stripped of its earlier warmth. She turned to face Sarah fully, and in that moment she looked different, harder, older, her beauty revealing itself as a carefully constructed mask that hid something cold and calculating beneath. Emma was weak. She wanted to leave Marcus, wanted to run back to her pathetic little life making logos for startup companies that would fail within a year. She didn't understand that when you commit to someone, you commit completely. No exits, no second thoughts. Marcus deserves better than doubt. The words hung between them like a confession, and Sarah realized with horror that this wasn't just about Marcus's jealousy. Claire had been complicit, perhaps even the architect of Emma's disappearance. Marcus returned before Sarah could respond, his presence filling the doorway with unspoken threat. "Claire, don't," he said, but his tone was tired rather than angry, the exhaustion of someone who'd had this conversation before, who knew his wife's tendency to reveal too much when challenged. "Sarah, you should go. Thank you for coming tonight, for trying to be a good neighbor despite everything." His hand moved to Claire's shoulder, fingers digging in slightly, a gesture of control disguised as affection. Sarah backed toward the door, her phone still recording everything, capturing evidence that might mean nothing in court, but everything to her understanding of what evil looked like when it wore a wedding ring and served expensive wine. She ran to her apartment and immediately called Detective Chen, her words tumbling out in a frantic stream as she replayed the recording, as she described Emma's jacket still hanging in the closet like a ghost refusing to leave. "We're executing the search warrant tomorrow morning," Chen told her, his voice grave with the weight of what they both suspected they'd find. "Sarah, I need you to pack a bag and leave the building tonight. Don't tell anyone where you're going. If what we suspect is true, if Emma Rodriguez is still in that apartment behind the walls, then you've just made yourself a witness that can't be allowed to testify." His words should have terrified her, but instead, they brought a strange calm, the certainty that Emma's story would finally be told, that silence was ending, that truth was clawing its way toward daylight. But Sarah never made it out of the building. As she zipped her overnight bag, her apartment door exploded inward, lock splintering under a force that suggested this had been planned, prepared for, anticipated. Claire stood in the doorway, no longer smiling, her face blank as a doll's and twice as terrifying. Behind her, Marcus held something that gleamed in the hallway light, a syringe filled with liquid that promised unconsciousness, or worse. "You couldn't just look away," Claire said softly, almost sadly, as if Sarah's curiosity was a character flaw that demanded correction. "Everyone else in this building learned how, but you had to be different. You had to care." And Sarah understood in that frozen moment that caring was the most dangerous thing you could do in a world where monsters lived behind apartment doors, and no one wanted to acknowledge that evil was ordinary, that it paid rent and said good morning and smiled while it swallowed people whole. Sarah woke to darkness and the smell of fresh concrete, her head pounding with whatever drug they'd used to keep her quiet during transport. Her hands were zip-tied behind her back, and she was lying on cold floor in what she realized with creeping horror was apartment 3B's bedroom, the room that had been renovated, the floor that had been replaced, the walls that had been opened and resealed. Next to her, close enough to touch in the blackness, she heard breathing that wasn't her own, shallow and weak, but unmistakably alive. "Emma," she whispered, and the breathing hitched became a sob, became a voice she'd only heard through walls saying, "I thought no one would come, thought everyone had forgotten." The lights flickered on, revealing a nightmare made real. The bedroom had been transformed into a cell, windows sealed behind decorative curtains that hid steel plates. door reinforced with locks that clicked only from the outside, walls lined with soundproofing that explained why no one had heard Emma's screams. Emma Rodriguez sat in the corner, thin as a skeleton, her eyes huge in a face carved hollow by months of captivity. She wore clothes that had once fit but now hung like burial shrouds. And Sarah realized that the police had been looking for a body when they should have been searching for a prisoner. That Emma's disappearance was worse than death, because death at least granted escape from watching your replacement, smile at the neighbors and wear your jacket and sleep in your bed while you rotted in a hidden room. "They'll kill us now," Emma said flatly, her voice stripped of hope by months of begging and prayers that went unanswered. "They kept me alive because Marcus couldn't fully commit to Claire while I was still breathing somewhere. Some psychological thing where he needed me to exist but not interfere. But you changed the equation. You brought the police. They can't let us tell the story." And Sarah understood the truth of it. That monsters were logical in their cruelty. That keeping Emma alive had served a purpose, but that purpose had expired the moment Detective Chen requested a search warrant. They were witnesses to be eliminated, evidence to be sealed behind the same walls that had hidden Emma for 6 months. But Sarah had done something Claire and Marcus hadn't anticipated. She'd sent the recording to multiple people before the party. Insurance stored in cloud servers that would release automatically if she didn't check in every 12 hours. Her sister had it, Detective Chen had it, her editor at the publishing house had it. Distributed evidence that couldn't be disappeared even if the witnesses could. The sound of sirens in the distance confirmed what Sarah had hoped. That Chen had tracked her phone's location before they destroyed it. That the search warrant was being executed right now. That the door would break down before Marcus and Claire could finish what they'd started. Emma's eyes filled with tears, disbelief mixing with desperate hope. The possibility that nightmares could end with rescue, rather than death. The door exploded inward with shouts of "Police!" and the thunder of boots on expensive flooring. Detective Chen appeared in the doorway, his face reflecting horror at the scene before him. 2 women bound and broken, evidence of prolonged captivity in a building where dozens of people lived and somehow heard nothing. Marcus and Claire were tackled in the hallway, their protests drowning beneath Miranda rights and handcuffs clicking shut, their carefully constructed lie collapsing under the weight of the truth that Sarah had refused to stop searching for. As paramedics cut through Sarah's zip ties and wrapped blankets around Emma's shaking shoulders, Sarah heard Claire screaming something about loyalty and misunderstanding. Heard Marcus crying that Emma had wanted to stay, spinning desperate narratives that no one would believe now that the cell door stood open and the victim could finally speak. 6 months later, Sarah testified at the trial that would send Marcus Webb and Claire Donovan to prison for life. Emma sat beside her in the gallery, still healing but alive. Her voice returned along with her ability to choose her own path, rather than having it dictated by someone else's pathological need for control. The jade plant thrived on Sarah's kitchen windowsill, its leaves bright green and reaching toward sun. A reminder that some things survived even when buried in darkness, that growth was possible after trauma. That caring about strangers was dangerous but necessary, because indifference was how monsters thrived. The building on 3rd Avenue stood unchanged. New tenants in apartment 3B now, but Sarah remained, refusing to let fear drive her from her home, determined to be the neighbor who noticed when something was wrong, who asked questions that made people uncomfortable, who understood that safety wasn't silence, but rather the courage to speak when everyone else looked away.